Hello, everybody. I'm Amanda Prewitt, and it's been such a pleasure being in class with you all this semester. I hope y'all gained something from this presentation. Hopefully you like it. Hopefully you have some comments about it. And I look forward to reviewing y'all's presentations as well. And hopefully y'all just have a great Thanksgiving and holiday break, and I'll get into the presentation. So before I go to the next slide, I do want to talk about the topic. So I chose my term paper topic to be Black student activism because I was inspired by the Black Lives Matter movement. This summer, a lot of things happened with police brutality and protests, and students just have been in the streets, on their campuses, just protesting. It's all over social media, it's everywhere. And so I wanted to understand a little bit more about the history of protests and Black student activism and the demands that they're requesting and how institutions tend to respond and what can be a better response from our institutions. I think a topic like this will better prepare us as administrators to help our students tear down oppressive systems and make sure we are fighting for racial equality on our campuses and making sure that our policies and procedures are equitable. And I don't know, I just feel like it's a very important topic that can get overlooked sometimes. And so hopefully you gain something from it. And yeah, so I'll be reading from my notes. So systemic policies in the US higher education system have disproportionately hurt Black college students in particular and racial minorities in general. So I wanted to use this project as an opportunity to analyze the students' demands and policies of the past that have contributed to the current racial climate in higher education. There is critical value in the objective account of the historically oppressed racial minority, and that institutional racism has intergenerational adverse consequences on its victims. The extent to which people fail to connect the disastrous ramifications of the past oppressive policies to the current economic inequalities between Black and white people in the United States is harmful. A failure to cast retrospective view into history to understand the contemporary problems of Black people would be a disservice to society as a whole. Therefore, I would like to start my presentation, the next slide, with the history of higher education, where it all started. So according to our textbook this semester, if you remember reading, it's from chapter 1. It's told us about how the first American colleges were founded in the 1600s, way back in the day. So if you remember in chapter 1, they also discussed the first several generations of higher education and how it did not include Black people, it didn't even include women. So it wasn't until the late 1800s that free Blacks were able to attend these institutions. More specifically, it wasn't until 1865 when Black people were officially able to acquire literacy and math skills. While that was the situation for Black people, white males, on the other hand, they created and attended renowned public and elite institutions. As a result of their privilege of being white then and now, successive generations of white students whose ancestors attended these prestigious institutions are still able to gain admission into some of their forebears' alma maters because of the alumni legacy that runs generations deep into their families. While there is continuous discussion about affirmative action, a lot of people see that as a privilege afforded to students of color. There seems to be total silence in the mainstream society about the privilege of legacy. Easier access into prestigious colleges have afforded white Americans economic and political opportunities that were second to none for other racial minorities. As a result of this privilege, most of them have accumulated social, economic, cultural, political capitals that empower them to monopolize and sustain the Eurocentric curriculum, control student recruitment, and faculty hiring in ways that would not have been possible had other racial minorities been afforded similar opportunities in the outset. Although the origins did not include Black people, they fought for a space in higher education. In 1954, um, the legendary Brown versus Board of Education case outlawed segregation, and institutions were pretty slow to comply with that ruling. The civil rights movement and integration led to more Black students attending college. What happened when Black people started occupying white spaces was pretty much expected. They began feeling isolated, they experienced racial hostility. So Black students were experiencing the struggles of being Black in America outside of campus, and they could not find relief at their colleges. Institutions lacked a preparation Institutions' lack of preparation for minority students and their unfair treatment led to Black students forming their own organizations to ensure their survival. So the first Black student union was the first Black student union was founded in the 1960s. Research has shown the importance of safe spaces for minority students. When Black students can create a safe space away from the dominant group, they experience increased feelings of belongingness and can experience social development without being devalued. These Black student groups were often modeled after the Black Power movement and began to make demands for change. This was the case for the Atlanta University Center, where a group of students formed the Atlanta Student Movement and drafted an appeal for human rights. And here's a picture of it on the on the left side of the screen. Maybe it's here, right? And it was published in local newspapers. The reason I mentioned this group of students is because their work was encouraged by their college presidents. So their college presidents were aware of them wanting to voice their opinions and be a part of the movement. And so they encouraged them and told them to write down their demands, write down what they wanted. And so the students did that. They listened to their college presidents and they drafted an appeal for human rights, and they had it posted in local newspapers. What they did with that is this led to Black students and white leaders of the community to engage in discussions with each other. And this led to discussions about desegregation of white-only spaces. There was also another group of Black students. This group was at the University of Washington, also in the 60s. They organized and pushed for social change on their campus. Now, this group was slightly different from the Atlanta group in that their demands was targeted at their administration rather than community leaders. So this group chose to target their demands at administration and wanted the increase of Black faculty and staff. They wanted courses that focused on racial diversity, and they wanted a specialized program that would improve Black students' graduation rate. So they were persistent, and when administration continued to ignore them, they held a sit-in in the president's office that lasted until the administration and the president agreed to their demands. So their hard work and determinism led to significant changes at University of Washington. These changes included a new program implementation, increases in minority enrollment. So now that we understand a little bit about the origins of Black student activism, I think it was time for us to shift our focus to this present generation. So student activism was reignited in the mid-2010s. Many of you may remember the protests that took place at Mizzou, which is University of Missouri, when Black students created the activist group Concerned Student 1950 and used social media to expose the institutional racism taking place at Mizzou. So Concerned Student 1950 garnered national attention and support as students demanded real change. Their activism eventually led to the resignation of the Mizzou president, Tim Wolf, who was accused of mishandling campus racism. So the rise of recent activism is, of course, connected to the Black Lives Matter movement, which was created by 3 women of color, Opal, Alicia, and Patrice. So they created the Black Lives Matter movement as their response to the tragic killing of Trayvon Martin. So the Black Lives Matter movement has been a force mobilizing Black students to demand systemic changes in how their institutions address systemic racism on and surrounding the campus. Black students continue to challenge institutions' historically race neutral ideologies, noting that these philosophies and dialogues continue to mask the unequal distribution of power in institutions and in society. Furthermore, just having an anti racist discourse absolves predominantly white institutions of any responsibility in substantively altering institutional policies and decision making, which leaves the burden of racism on people of color. It's not enough for institutions, administrations, presidents to be anti racist. That's not enough. We need them to then have the action behind it to dismantle systems of oppression. So, this past summer, many of us watched the video of George Floyd taking his last breath. The killings of Breonna Taylor, Ahmaud Arbery, George Floyd led to widespread protests and outrage. The injustices faced by the Black community has resulted in young Black children, young Black college students demanding more from people of power, including their university administration. So there's a cost to activism. So my license and certifications are in counseling. So mental health is a very important component for me. And I feel like it's something that is often overlooked in the conversation about activism. So to be a student activist, you need a considerable amount of passion. And it's an emotional investment that students are making with their activism. And while activism can promote a critical look at the perpetuation of inequality within an institution, ultimately the challenging of existing power structures can be perceived as a threat and calls for reprimand. One research study found that when students of color reacted to injustice with heightened emotions and protest, white students, the students that were surveyed were white, and they viewed this as a threat. So students are being seen as a threat while off campus just being Black in America. And then on campus, when they express their frustrations, their white counterparts are also viewing them as a threat. So relationships, moods, and grades are all frequently impacted because of involvement in activism. Historically, students have been subject to disciplinary actions for taking stands, particularly at predominantly white institutions. We'll refer to that as PWIs. Marginalized students, specifically students of color, when speaking against inequity, can be labeled as emotionally unstable, deviant, a nuisance, and they can face social, academic, and emotional and physiological consequences. Black students at PWIs find themselves constantly engaged in protest and activism as they try to find comfort and acceptance in their educational environment. Some of the consequences they face include alienation, poor academic performance, sanctioning, expulsion, threats, and even racial violence. Microaggressions also impact the experiences of Black students and underrepresented students in general. They can particularly be mentally and emotionally exhausting for Black students. Within this understanding of the emotional consequences associated with overt resistance, it is essential that scholars, administrations, leaders recognize the strategic process involved in Black student leadership as individuals determine roles in disrupting institutionalized racism. So demands. So what students want from their activism varies from institution to institution to, Black student group to Black student group to the individual student may want something different from the other individual student. Not all Black people are not a monolith, so they're going to want different things. Throughout my research on doing this, I found that some students wanted simple things such as well, what I consider simple things, such as the removal of symbols of white supremacy. So this is like the removal of Confederate statues or like the renaming of buildings. So if your building is named after a white person that owned enslaved individuals, maybe it's time to rename that building. And that's something that students are demanding. Some students are also demanding more diversity in leadership and faculty. They're tired of seeing white male leaders. They're tired of having all white leaders. They want to see Black leaders, and not just leaders, they also want their professors to be of the same background as them. And research shows that students are more successful in classes that don't put whites and male at the center of their teachings. And so I think diversification, research has shown diversification does academically benefit the student as well. So they also want structural support and change. And so this also includes policy changes, changes in how institutions go about implementing policies. So even if an institution states in their policy that they're, are equitable and whatnot, the culture of the campus may say something different. It may be written in the policy that there's going to be certain ramifications or certain consequences if students act upon X, Y, and Z. But students know that, white students are going to be able to get away with that, but Black students are not. So these types of things, Black students want those to be addressed and are demanding that from their institutions. Some students also want their institutions to cut ties with the police, their local police officers. And this is an interesting demand to make, but it makes sense. So with the recent rise of, not the rise, but the protests involved about police brutality, more students are concerned about their interactions with the police, and they want their institution to be sensitive to that. And one article that I read, a young lady at her institution was really pushing for her school to cut ties with their local police because she stated that their local police officers tend to be so basically racial profile. And these racial profiling lead to more interactions, more Black people interacting with the police, which can then lead to more altercations, which leads to more Black people being convicted of crimes, whether they committed it or did not commit it, meaning they have to drop out of school and serve some jail time. So their focus on the school to prison pipeline is very important, and students are demanding that their institutions do something about that. So institutional response. So institutions respond to racism and other events or other racial events in multiple ways. They usually are quick to put out a statement or maybe a tweet or Instagram post or something on the website, something showing they're sympathetic and they're supportive. This summer, you're probably seeing a lot of institutions put out statements about George Floyd or about the protests and about how, we care about our Black students and, racism is bad, things of that nature. But they didn't really offer any action behind that. Institutions also have a tendency to put together panels and committees that don't really lead to any real changes. I think panel discussions are great, but it's just a discussion. And so if there's nothing behind that discussion, then there's really no point. I feel like it's just a way to kind of make students happy. Like, oh, see, look, we're doing something, but what they're doing really isn't substantial. Institutions have a tendency to place diversity over inclusion. Just by diversifying your campus does not mean that you are doing your part or you're not doing enough to end the oppressive systems that your institution upholds. And they also have a tendency to place the burden of educating the masses on racism and oppression. They place that burden on Black students and faculty. So they place that on Black student leaders to lead those discussions, to come up with plans. And that's not their responsibility. It's not Black people's responsibility to educate everyone else on how not to be an oppressor. And so administrators and presidents of colleges need to take on that responsibility of doing the work themselves and being those leaders at their institution and not relying solely on their Black communities. So what does real change look like? So during my research for this paper, one article that I read really discussed using the Black Lives Matter movement as an educational framework, and I thought that was very interesting. The main purpose or the main component of using it as a framework means that the institution is responding to Black resistance with Black liberation. So Black resistance, what that means is that protests are an example of Black resistance. There's a system in place that's harming us, and we are resisting that. We are protesting, we are making demands. Black liberation is the tearing down of oppressive systems. And so that's the appropriate response to resistance. And so we want institutions to do that. We want institutions to do their part in tearing down their oppressive systems. We also want institutions to celebrate and support Black students and other minority groups. So this is not just in February. This is not just when something happens in the community and then all of a sudden we need to have an event or a panel discussion. No, this needs to be a continuous thing. Black students, other minority students need to feel welcomed and supported at their institutions. Support also means that we need to start addressing the impact that activism has on students. It affects them emotionally, it affects our academics, our mental health is impacted, and institutions need to be aware of that and then offer supports to address that, offer programs to address those stressors on those students. Institutions also need to take responsibility and take action. It's not enough to put out statements. It's not enough to say that Black Lives Matter and post that on your school website. Then what are you now doing to show that? And I think more students are aware that their institutions have a tendency to just say things to appease them and kind of keep them quiet and pacification, and it's not enough anymore. Students are aware of what's happening and want real change from their institution. They want policy changes, they want leadership changes, they want program changes, and they're demanding that. Campus policing. Students are also wanting their institutions to cut ties with the police officers. If your institution is reinforcing the school to prison pipeline, what can you do about that to change that? Does that mean that your institution needs to cut ties with local police officers? Is that a discussion that needs to be had on what that will look like for your institution and your community? That may be a bridge that you have to cross as a future administrator. And it's just something to consider, because it may be appropriate if your local police officers have a history of being of racial profiling, of only approaching Black individuals or minority individuals. Then it may be time to cut ties with local police officers and only stay in-house with your security. That may be a conversation that needs to be had on campuses across the country. So lastly, I chose this quote from Ta-Nehisi Coates from his book, Between the World and Me. I chose this quote because I think it speaks to institutions' tendency to say that they mean well and that they have good intentions, but they don't necessarily do anything with that. It's not enough to have good intentions. So this quote states that it does not matter that the intentions of individual educators are noble. Forget about intentions. What any institution or its agents intend for you is secondary. Our world is physical. Learn to play defense, ignore the head, and keep your eyes on the body. Very few Americans would directly proclaim that they are in favor of Black people being left to the streets. But a very large number of Americans will do all they can to preserve the dream. No one directly proclaimed that schools were designed to sanctify failure and destruction, but a great number of educators spoke of personal responsibility in a country authored and sustained by a criminal irresponsibility. The point of this language of intention and personal responsibility is broad exoneration. Mistakes were made, bodies were broken, people were enslaved, We meant well, we tried our best. Good intention is a hall pass through history, a sleeping pill that ensures the dream. I think is important as future higher education leaders to make sure we're not just saying that we mean well and not just to offer good intentions. That's not enough. Black students have been fighting for a long time. We were late to the game. We were not offered a space in higher education for generations. And then once we arrived, we still had to face so much racial hostility that we're still facing today. So I understand when institutions say that, change takes time, but, it's been a long time. Black people have been putting in the time and making the demands. So it's no longer enough to say, it takes time. We're going to do our best. Change needs to happen now. It's been enough time. So that's my presentation. Thank you all for listening. Hopefully you gained something, and hopefully as future administrators and future college leaders that you are more prepared to assist your students, your student activists with liberation and Black liberation. And so now it's all up to us to do the work of helping our students and our institutions be the best it can be. And that is all. So have a great holiday, great end of your semester. And thanks, everybody.